So, welcome back, or welcome, if you're here for the first time. My name is Set, and this is Set Speaks. If you've watched me before, if you've seen the last episode, you already know what this is going to be about. If you haven't watched the last episode, I would say that you should probably watch that before coming into this one, because Archetypes, which is what this video is about, is something that I touched on very vaguely in the last episode. The only reason that it needs its own episode is, quite frankly, because it's a little bit of a complex topic. It's been around for a long time, despite the fact that the actual research behind it psychologically is kind of in its infancy. So this whole archetype idea began with Plato, only his thesis called it a form. So if we go back and we look at how Plato described forms, essentially what his idea was that every single perception or perspective that humans have on objects, other humans, other descriptions, adjectives, nouns, verbs, everything has different forms, right? So if we use this diagram here, we can see that the true form of beauty is not just specific things, but as it reaches a human mind, it becomes a concept, right? So a concept is a second form of it. The concept of beauty is then manifested into the 3D through individual beautiful entities, but the beautiful is actually based on the concept that is withheld in the person, right? So from that, you can have the limitations of that, such as we see, the girl, the picture of the, scenic setting, a flower, a vase, something like that. There's a lot of different ways to describe this, so I'm going to be going through all of them, but focusing on this one as a beginning. His main idea was that for every single form or, physical item or thought process, there was a higher form of that specific thing that had no flaws to it whatsoever by any definition, right? And so when we go back and we look at Plato's thesis and the word forms, right? Essentially what his idea was that the physical world was not the real world, right? So if we look at this diagram, we'll use this diagram to kind of explain it better. Ultimately, there's a reality that exists beyond our physical world, and these actual forms, right? These forms of ideas, these forms of beings, these forms of thought, these forms of any noun, adjective, verb, anything that you could really think of, right, had absolutely no change in the concept or ideal that transcends time and space. So if we're using this picture, we would see that the ideal and unchanging form of beauty exists within a higher realm. But as humans, because we need to perceive things and apply adjectives, nouns, verbs, whatever to them, there's a concept that is built within our minds. It's a construct, such as time and space. It's all full circle. But as it reaches this concept within the human mind, there's individual beautiful entities that apply to the concept that is within the person's mind, correct? This creates the limitations of it. His idea basically was that forms, as they're transcended down into different dimensions, become more flawed and have the ability to change and, have time and space constraints. It's the same thing, just back over again. The forms in the highest realms are anything more real. So you have it can even come down to the word good, right? Or, the roundness of something. Like I said, any noun, adjective, verb, whatever. Every single applied thought or concept that we have as a higher form that is flawless under all definitions. Now, it took a while for this to kind of catch on until we see, Carl Jung come through with the word archetypes. So these archetypes are the living systems of reactions and aptitudes that determine the individual's life in invisible ways. The archetypes are essentially who you are before subpersonalities are formed, before you are conflicted with other thoughts of other things, whereas, you would essentially, ideally, be able to stay true to your archetype. Now, the development of sub-personalities and the development of other thought patterns and concepts is part of the human experience, but individually, they all are very different. Individually, one thing might be more beautiful to the other. Individually, one color might look different to the other. It also comes down to even like communication, right? The hardest thing about human communication is actually trying to describe complex thoughts. If I try to describe to you something that I might not have all the words for, or that there might not be a word for to fully describe yet, you would build a different mental image than the image of the thing or the actual thing that I saw. This can happen in any form of communication. So archetypes are the secret forces behind human behavior as well. You're always going to kind of default back to it, even if you are doing something that isn't necessarily right. So shadow work would be getting more into touch with who you really are. That's how that relates to each other. That's why these are so difficult to kind of describe. This itself is a complex topic that is very difficult to describe. So Jung describes these archetypes as the forms in which instincts assume. So everyone has basic human instincts, eat, hunt, survival instincts, fight or flight. But these archetypes are essentially ways to categorize and understand how you as a person might react in those situations, right? So because these patterns are pre-existing, archetypes are predictable. No matter what image of the hero you hold in your mind, for an example, a certain pattern of behavior and personality traits arise, like bravery, valor, persistence, and action. I guess I should go back and say that hero is actually one of the archetypes, but no matter what, when you think of certain archetypes, certain traits are applied to them by default. Mine, for example, is the explorer. If you know me, this shouldn't surprise you. The people that know me, it shouldn't surprise you. Especially if you don't even know what the explorer is. You can kind of tell. It's just being able to travel a lot, enjoying freedoms, spiritual exploration. If you couldn't tell, that's a pretty big thing for me. But yeah, different archetypes evoke different emotions. For example, the lovers are passionate, the kings are magnanimous, warriors are courageous, and as even everyone sees now, sadists are hateful, right? Sadist is an archetype. It's just defaulting to hate. That's actually also an adjective. You can call someone a sadist. But more so because it is an archetype, and it is because it is a stereotype as well. Stereotypes and archetypes are not the same thing. But there is some truth to the way that they interconnect. Does that make sense? To kind of put this into another, maybe easier form, if you think of the last TV show or the last movie that you saw, right? You consider all of the characters of that story, not just the hero or the protagonist. They're all operating in your mind at once, right? So you have the main characters, the side characters, the back characters, all of them. That's what it looks like in your mind at all times. That's why that little voice inside of you is something that you shouldn't ignore, because most of the time it's going to be coming straight from your base archetype. I didn't want to phrase that wrong. Base archetype is a good one. We begin to see how complex our minds are really when we're faced in situations when we ignore our inner voice and we decide to do things that we want to do. We argue with the inner voice, if you will. So this field of study, that contains archetypes as well as other things, is called psychoanalysis, right? And a lot of people are scared of this, like coming into contact with psychoanalysts and things like that. But the question is, why? Why would you be scared to find out who you are? And it goes back to Sigmund Freud, right? So Freud was a little bit older than Carl Jung, but they worked in the same field. They didn't necessarily have a name for it at the time because it was, brand new. They renamed it Archetypes and became, obsessed with recreating it in a way that made more sense to people. So when Freud was doing his naming, he chose psychoanalysis. Jung wanted it to be psyche analysis. The difference being psychoanalysis is assuming that it's a study of mental illnesses, craziness, overall just mentally ill people. when in reality that wasn't the case. And Carl Jung saw that. That's why he wanted to call it, psyche analysis. So what Jung was able to see was that he was the exact same as his patients. Freud didn't see that at the time. He talked to people who claimed that they were mentally ill or crazy or, had voices in their head, and immediately began to try to fix them. Jung had a lot more humility, right? He realized that he was the same as them. And while he was studying, was able to realize that we're all fragmented, we're all divided, and we're all ruled by unconscious forces. As a result, Jung's research became a lot better for, the average person. For Freud, his was a little bit more, first of all, a bit more judgmental, a little bit insensitive, to be honest, but it became the study of crazy people. And it kind of gained that stigma and kept people away for a very long time. It's kind of part of the reason that the whole study itself is in its infancy, really, because it's hard to get people to want to try to fix themselves if, seeing a psychoanalyst means that by default you're seeing someone who studies crazy people, when in reality that's not really what it is, right? Although we don't like to admit it, as a whole, human beings are mostly unconscious. And like I said, Jung was able to find that out. This is where the archetype thing becomes necessary, because we remain unaware of our real motivations, what drives our actions, what drives our emotions, what drives our behaviors, and even our decisions. We are also unconscious of the emotions expressing themselves behind social masks that we present to each other, right? So it's very easy to get lost in the mask that you try to hold with people. It's very easy to get lost in stereotypes, stigmas, things such as. Our need to understand and work with archetypes is greater now than at any point in human history. Because, in past generations, humanity had rich mythologies and rituals designed to maintain psychic order, which is why Plato's works were, hailed for the longest amount of time. Now we study them as relics, and, they're considered ancient rituals of the past, which modern people perceive to be archaic. There's a lot more to be said for that. There's probably some conspiracy theories around that too. Something I'll probably be looking into later. But the things that really came from the basics, right? Plato's thesis and Jung's theses and Freud's theses, even though they were a little bit insensitive and also a bit misguided, were all super important in discovering archetypes and discovering the very basis of human unconsciousness. Right? So, before I get into the lists, before I get into, what it looks like when you're trying to discover what archetype you are, what archetypes you have within you that interact, and even kind of start to build a list of your sub-personalities. The biggest understanding that has to come from this is archetypes are everywhere. Like I said, archetypes and stereotypes are not the same thing, but like with sadists are a stereotypical hater, and a sadist archetype is a hateful person. Okay, so they have similarities, but only because a lot of them stem from archetypes. It's just, I say it so much, that's just how it is. But to start off, I'm going to show some lists of archetypes. There's quite a lot of them. Like I said, it's been studied by many people after Jung. It's been studied and improved upon and added on to. So to start, we have the healthy masculines, we have the shadows, and this is a good one here, the shadows. This will actually help you determine how it's best to work with your shadow self if you can determine what your shadow archetype is. For obvious reasons, I feel like I really don't have to get into that. Moving forward, we have boyhood and the boyhood shadow. The reason that there's not going to be a girl and a girl shadow is because the divine feminine or the feminine traits are naturally in touch with their emotions. Hence, we don't necessarily need a feminine description, right? So these are all gender neutral. but they decided to give it boyhood and boyhood shadow. But moving on, we have the 12 main archetypes. This is where you're probably going to see the most of. This is what you're probably going to end up finding about yourself first. Caroline Myss was another person who looked into it very deeply, was another person who ended up adding on to it and creating a kind of side study for it. We have the enneagrams, like I was talking, the actual diagrams that help you to connect everything within yourself. There's actually 2 versions of the enneagrams, and it's because there was multiple people studying it, and then multiple people studied it again and redid it. So there's actually a lot there. And if you were so inclined, you could even pull some off of the Greek god list. These are actually helpful. It's not a joke. I mean, it's kind of funny to, assume that you're Zeus or something like that, but it is kind of helpful, especially if you're a king or a hero archetype. Finding exactly one of these Greek gods would probably help you narrow things down a little bit. Now, up next is the list of just over 300 archetypes. Yeah, 300. Now, there's probably more out there, but this is the longest list that I could find that I wanted to include. A lot of them are going to be repeated because it's basically just a detailed and compiled list. These are the ones that you're going to be able to actually go and research on and try to see if they're you. So, yeah. If you want to stop the video, look through them, you can. If you want to screenshot them for later, you can start researching them, see how they act related to you. I think that'd be very helpful if you wanted to start your shadow work that way. Now, how can you work with your archetypes? How can you see how they interconnect with your mind, how they interconnect with your emotions, and how you react to certain things? Well, one, there's dream work, which we've talked about in the last episode as well. If you hadn't seen it yet and you're still here, dream work is essentially just taking note of your dreams and writing things down and using the symbolicness of your dreams to kind of understand. But you have to set the intention beforehand. I did this last night before because I didn't really think that using your dreams was as useful as some of these other methods, but yeah, it was actually super insightful and I got a lot out of it. I really saw the explorer within me, but I also saw some other archetypes as well. So, the more you know, the more you learn, right? Next we have active imagination, which is actually kind of a form of meditation, really. You're basically just actively inviting those archetypes to interact with you consciously. This is good for creative people and, artists, singers, musicians, people with very active imaginations already. If you don't already have a super active imagination, it might not be as successful for you. Like I said, there's a lot of ways to do this, and there's a lot of ways to even do all of shadow work. It's all a user experience, whatever works best for you. Moving forward, though, we have psychosynthesis, which Roberto Assaginoli, Roberto Assaginoli. He was the one who created a thesis around psychosynthesis. And what he had to say about it was, we are not unified. We often feel that we are, because we do not have many bodies and many limbs, and because one hand doesn't usually hit the other. But metaphorically, that is exactly what does happen within us. Several sub-personalities are continually scuffling. Impulses, desires, principles, and aspirations are engaged in an unceasing struggle. So the stages of psychosynthesis are similar to active imagination, right? So you have recognition, a recognition of sub-personalities, a recognition of archetypes. You have acceptance, you have coordination, integration, and synthesis. The goal of psychosynthesis is unity. Just as shadow work, it's all about integrating your shadow, or your archetype, really, into yourself so that you can become more of who you are truly meant to be. And 4, we have the internal family system. Now, this is the most effective by scientific study, by, psychoanalysis. getting used to these words. There's a lot of them, there's a lot of buzzwords. I tried not to throw too many in this video, but I am going to use psychoanalysis. Just works better. So Robert Schwartz was a psychologist with a background in family therapy, developed the internal family system, right? So he was working with numerous patients who all spoke of voices in their heads telling them to, for example, overeat and then purge, right? Something that we all have, basic impulses. At first, he thought he was dealing with multiple personality disorders, right? So this was a long time ago. But after inquiring how these patients had heard these voices, he was shocked to find that he heard them too. So what he decided to do was create the internal family system and play characteristic roles that help define a person's inner world. So in the way that a person might interact with their family, an archetype and subpersonalities could be symbolically shown as different members of a family and how they interact with each other, right? This is something that it's going to be very difficult for you to do on your own. You can do it on your own, but it's going to take a lot more time to do it on your own, just because you need to have a lot of the basic concepts down. And even going through some of these basic concepts on my own, I kind of deemed it not something that I want to do on my own. Not for fear of coming up with the wrong answer, but for fear of confusing myself by coming up with multiple answers. So this particular method is the most robust due to its basic assumptions, right? And the basic assumptions of this is that it's the nature of the mind to be subdivided into indeterminate number of subpersonalities or parts, right? We were talking about like a movie, there's hundreds of characters, not all of them have screen time in the same way, but they all interact in one way and help to create the reality that we live in, right? Number 2, everyone has a self, and the self can and should lead this system. And if we were to relate it to a family, I would say it would be more of the father figure, the one that, takes the lead of the family. The non-extreme intention of each part is something positive for the individual. There are no bad parts, and the goal of this therapy is not to eliminate these parts, but instead to help them find their non-extreme roles, right? So, just as we were talking about in the Shadow Self episode, you're not trying to eliminate anything. You're trying to combine and interconnect pieces to ultimately come into a union with it. It is the same thing with the IFS, which is what I'm going to refer to it as now that we know that it's the family system. As we develop, our parts develop and form complex system of interactions among themselves. Therefore, systems theories can be applied to these internal systems. When the system is reorganized, parts can change rapidly. Changes in the internal system will affect the changes in the external system and vice versa. This assumption implies that both the internal and external levels of the system should be assessed. Now, the IFS could also very well be used in your shadow work, even without just using archetypes. It can be used to kind of use your reactions to things, use the things that are negative, the feelings that you have. You can use the IFS for this. It is a very robust system. It's actually pretty brilliant. I'm not gonna lie, it's not the newest thing, but it's brilliant. So to go over it one more time, because I know I've said it a few times, but I think, kind of showing off a list at the end is important. So the overall goals of using the internal family system to achieve balance and harmony within the internal system, to differentiate and elevate the self so it can be an effective leader in the system, your main archetype. When the self is in the lead, the parts will provide input to the self, but will respect the leadership and the ultimate decision making. And all parts will exist and lend talents that reflect their non-extreme intentions, right? So even if you do have sadist tendencies, they can be used for good things. Being skeptical isn't the worst thing in the world. It's just being skeptical of everything is the worst thing in the world. It's not good for you to be skeptical of everything, to not trust anyone, to, hide different things from yourself and others on purpose. But yeah, that basically sums it up. If you really want to, I would go and look into the internal family system after you find your archetype so that you know how to use it. It's important. But yeah, most of the methods, otherwise, not, like I said, all of the ones in the shadow work episode are good. they're very good to use. Some of them take more time than others. Some of them take more discipline. Some of them take, a change in perspective. But no matter what, using your archetype is always going to be the pinnacle, because other methods that we use, like from neuro-linguistic programming, which is basically affirmations, to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is essentially just watching what you think about yourself, what you think about others, they all have limited results. Sometimes you need to incorporate more than one to reach the full integration, right? So the effect, the change, the certain behaviors that change, they all change under certain conditions, but by working with your archetype, you're able to change them for all conditions. You're able to understand, as soon as you are in a situation, how you should react to that situation. And the rest of the sub-personalities would respect this, but lend their talents to you, so to speak, so that you can perform the best in any given situation. Right? Does that make sense? So the other methods, they tend to fail because they rely on the premise that we can train the unconscious, which is, in my opinion, both true and not true. You can't necessarily train the unconscious, but you can rewire the subconscious, right? So the un and the sub, not a whole lot of a difference between them, except for the unconscious, like described before, is essentially who we are at our primal instinct, who we are when we're born, the very basis of the things that we want to do, the way that we want to lead our lives, right? The belief that we can condition these primal forces, or, the instincts, to obey our conscious at will is not accurate. It's very different. You can only rewire it. You can't change the whole system, right? You can change the way one way works with the other one, right? If you disagree with something, you can rewire yourself to disagree with something else on the same topic, but you can't rewire yourself or redo the entire thing to where you don't disagree with anything about that topic at all, right? It's very fine point issues when you talk about the subconscious and the unconscious, and the conscious, really, even though the conscious is the one that we have the most control over, or really all the control over. We just kind of don't take that into account. We don't take into account the complexity of humans, the complexity of the human psyche, the complexity of, our persistent nature in correlation with archetypes. We just don't. But again, I'm going to come back to it. Learning your archetype, working with it, and then employing it into shadow work, employing it into your meditations, employing it into affirmations, employing it into your journaling, into thinking about your thoughts. There was a good word for it here. What was it? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Self-therapy counts as therapy. But cognitive behavioral therapy. It still works, but the archetype is going to be the very pinnacle of all of that. It's going to be the determining factor in what you do with your life. For instance, to kind of finish off and close off, as I am the explorer, there are certain professions that would work best for me due to the fact that, they meet my needs at a very basic level. But when my sub-personalities come into play, when sub-archetypes come into play, it starts to limit the list, right? So, a long time ago, I wanted to be a pilot. That's great. I just get bored super easily. I figure after a while, I'm not going to like the job as much as I want to, and then I would have wasted a lot of my time doing training and certifications and tests for something that might not be as fulfilling to me anymore. So that led me to shadow work, finding myself, finding my archetype, understanding sub-personalities, and overall choosing specific careers, if you could call them that allow me to be my best self. And when you start doing this for yourself as well, you'll notice the changes. It might be difficult at first implementing these changes because, there's still emotional and behavioral things that need to be healed, part of the shadow self that hasn't been healed yet, inner trauma, inner things that won't be discussed unless you discuss them, that kind of deal. But very slowly but surely, the journey will pay off. and it will be more fulfilling. Like Carl Jung said, living a full, balanced life the way that we were all meant to live.